Right, so hello everybody. I'm going to turn the music down just a tad, so it's quite loud. But yeah, hello again. It's been a while since I've actually done one of these live streams, and I hope that it's something that I stick to now, especially if you've followed us before and you've seen some of the blog posts that we've put out, or I've put out. You'll understand why I'm hoping that this becomes more of a routine now. But since it's been such a long time, I kind of just wanted to take today to refresh everybody on what's happened since the last stream that I did, which originally was on Twitch actually. So I've made the decision now to switch over to Mixer, which we think makes more sense for the size of the channel that we essentially have at this point. I mean, it's super hard to stand out on Twitch, especially with the amount of different content creators and also high quality content as well. Like, I'm not saying that what I'm doing is of low quality by any means, but like, you to really go above and beyond and get that viewer base, you have to be at it for a long time. And I think Mixer is the way to go, honestly, in terms of just the platform in general and also the community as well. Like, just from having looked around a little bit, it seems much more family friendly, much more relaxed, not very oversaturated. You know, just overall I think it just makes a lot of sense, which is why the change has been made. So I'm just waiting here for the Real Engine to load so that I can actually start showing you guys what has happened since the last time that I streamed, because a lot of development things actually have come together in the last month and a half, I believe it is, or 2 months since the stream last happened. All of which you can, by the way, watch afterwards if you want to on the channel. I'm sure somewhere at some point I'll put a link to that on the YouTube side, at least, once we've re-uploaded that content to our main Arcode channel, because everything's kind of been rebranded recently. And no longer am I doing personal live streams as such. It's actually part of the Arcode branding, because we want to basically tie everything back into the business that we've made and really double down on our efforts for that. So first of all, I want to show you what's actually been achieved. Now, this slow loading is a quirk of something I've implemented recently, and I will explain that at some point. But this is the step that we're at. So there is a UI, there's camera controls, there's placement controls. So not all of the UI is implemented, but that's because we're waiting on a UI redesign from Joshua Matthews to happen before we really kind of build in the functionality for that. One thing you may notice straight away as well is the amount of lag that happens while looking at this object here. And this is something that I'm going to be addressing either today or in the live streams going forward. It's actually one of the biggest things on my roadmap as far as fixing is concerned. So you see over here, no issues at all. Can fly around just fine, no lag. Looking at the shape, however, massive performance hit. So I'll talk a bit more about that later at some point. But first of all, let's look at the code base and see how some things have changed quite significantly, actually. I also want to point out that the terrain, I believe it's the terrain controller, has had some massive rewrites in terms of the way that we load in blocks and also the way that we smooth the voxel pieces as well. So scrolling down to, where is it? Yeah, if we scroll down to these functions, for those of you that remember the previous posts, or if you've just seen them on YouTube, for example, you may remember that this was actually something I think that was mostly part of these functions. It was inbuilt before. And it still is to an extent, but we've basically taken all of the functionality out of each function and placed it in its own thing, which I think makes perfect sense. As any software developer should know, you should always abstract your functionality where you're duplicating code and put it in its own thing. So we've done a lot of optimizations in terms of the way the code actually works and the work that it's doing. That has had the unintended side effect of simplifying a little bit the smoothing visually, but that complexity is something that we can add in now that we've made it more performance friendly. So to just give a brief overview of what's actually happening here, but the first basic check that we do is essentially to see, okay, are we referencing the top or bottom of an exposed block? So if it's on the top, for example, or it's on the bottom, and one of the surfaces is exposed, then what we want to do is run the rest of the smoothing code. So we'll leave the blocks as they are if they're not exposed on the top or bottom, so it doesn't make any sense really to smooth it out if it's inside of another object. But I've also implemented another quick check, which is something that I'd utilised before. So this check essentially just makes sure that we're not editing outside of the world boundaries, which is something that's super important. You know, obviously we don't want to be accessing outside of the array, so it's very important that we don't do that. Also, we don't need the Z array checking, because if this function is being run, then we know for a fact that we're not above or below the maximum Z buffer boundaries, if that makes sense. So now this is the most extreme simplification I think that I've done so far in this rewriting process of these functions for determining the shape and also determining the pattern of the adjacent blocks around a block to make sure that it's smoothed out correctly. So this is all basically just one line, and what it does is all we're essentially doing is checking whether or not these Boolean conditions are true, and then just adding them up in a number. So this, for example, would check, let's get paint open, that's always a good idea. So let's say we have our cube, and we want to determine what this corner should be doing. Beautiful cube, I know, very wonky, but whatever. We first want to check this side, and this side to see whether or not we should lower this corner. Is it really worth it? So if two of these blocks are empty, then we lower it, so any two of these. And to do that, we simply say, is this empty? If it is, decrement a number. Is this empty? Decrement a number, and so on. And so we do that for each of the corners and each of the adjacent blocks. And it's really that simple. And then that's added into an array of numbers. So it's only 4 numbers that we need, 1 for each corner. And then what we're doing is passing in that data into determine shape. So this just takes the pattern that we've generated and says, okay, we've got these numbers, what shape in terms of the designed shape that we have in Engine? So let me show you. So what of these shapes that we have does it best fit to? And also another quick note is that it also, this little bit here simply limits the number which it can be. It's either -1 or 0. It's not like -2, for example, if all of these are true, or -3, or that anything like that. But this data is then passed into the determine shape function, which is largely the same, but due to the simplifications that have been made, there is a little bit less code in here, I think, than there was previously. A quick side note as well is the rotation code has been simplified ever so slightly as well to reflect the changes that have been made here. So all this does is essentially, in fact, we'll ignore this for now. Basically, it just runs through each pattern in order 4 times, rotating it each time to see which shape best matches the pattern of corner raises or lowers that we have in the system. So for example, let's say we had a ramp, 2 of the sides would obviously be lowered and 2 of them would be raised. So we could scan through here. But this would be the one that we have. We select the shape that we want, which is shape 2, which references the ramp in the spawning code. And then the rotation for this block, so what orientation it's placed in the world in, is determined by how many times this for loop has run. So if we've checked it in each rotation, and say we get to the 3rd rotation and this pattern matches, then great, then we know what rotation it is, and we know what shape it is as well. And this is just shifting. This is essentially just shifting those array bits around 1 space each time. Every time we do a rotation, every time we run through this for loop. And all this thing up here is doing, this is part of the simplifications that were made, is if the block is considered upside down, so if there's space underneath the block rather than above, we're simply just inverting the corners that we're checking so that the shapes that we're checking against remain the same, but we can just use different orientations upside down for those shapes. So that's a quick overview of this code and the changes that have been made. I don't think there have been any other major changes other than the performance stuff I'm going to talk about in a bit. Not as far as existing code goes. The one thing that I really want to show off is this new editor camera setup that we have. So to start off with, we have some very simple kind of state variables, sorry, and also some important. This might look a bit scary for those who haven't used Unreal before, but these are important. See them as just our settings, basically, that can be controlled by the UI. All this uProperty macro does is expose that to the Blueprints UI setup that we have. So just see these as normal variables that are just being edited occasionally from an exterior source. So we just have all of those settings there. We also have some camera stuff. So we have like the camera velocity, for example. So this is just a vector saying which direction we're going in and how fast we're doing it. We have the camera rig itself, so that we have a reference to that. We also have the voxel controller, the terrain controller, so that we have a reference to that, so we can call events to, well, sorry, not events, but call functions from the camera, from the editor. So let's say we want to spawn in a circular brush. That can be done from inside of this controller. And then here we have all of the functions that are bound to the input system in Unreal, and I'll show those and how those work in a second. And again, these are just some very simple functions down here that allow us to control certain things that you would expect as part of kind of like a brush terrain editor. So let's dive into the code and how it's played out. So it seems like there's a lot going on, but it's mostly just duplicated code for various states. So in our tick function, we are updating our camera's velocity based on the inputs that we've received. We're also decelerating the input as well every frame. We're then applying the calculated velocity to the camera. And this is another thing as well. There's this function called time since last placement, variable called time since last placement. Essentially what that does is just make sure that we aren't spamming the brush placement every frame. So it just gives us a bit of a controllable delay between how fast we want the mouse button that's being held down to update the brushes in the scene. And this is something that was just an optimization decision because it was kind of lagging when lots of brushes were going in all at once. So that's one such performance improvement that's relatively simple. So this is a big bulk of the work that went into this controller itself, and that's simply attaching the input. So we're taking the input component, which is just the thing in the scene that controls all of the, say, keyboard or mouse input. We're then binding any input setups that we have in Unreal's input menu, which I'll show you now, if I can remember where it is. I believe it's in project settings. Let me go down to input here. So you can see that inside of this UI menu I've set up lots of different inputs that I want the engine to recognize, and you can see that this is bound to like right mouse button, for example. So removing voxels, you just hold down the right mouse button and that would activate. So going back to the code, basically you can see that I've mapped those names that I had in that menu to these bindable actions. And what this does is it maps this input on the keyboard to this function in the code and it bases that calling on the setting that's put in here. It's also similar for bind axis, which, if you're familiar, are not actually they're not actually just single calls. They're more like continuous input. So it's like a continuous input state that can vary across a range rather than just be a single function call. So here's a good example of an axis call. Bindable axes input a number based on what key is pressed, and you can scale that number up or down depending on your preferences. In this case, it's -1 and +1 for this would be for A and D controls. So it'd be -1 if it was A, +1 if it was D, and then that number would get put into here and increase or decrease the amount added to velocity on the x-axis. So that's a good example of how the input system has been set up. A simpler one would be those simple bind actions rather than bind axes. And this is just one for increased diameter. So whenever this is called based on the thing that I've mapped it to, which I believe is control scroll wheel. So whenever that's increased up, this function is called and a setting is simply changed. That's all it is really. A variable is just incremented each time. So I feel like that's fairly self-explanatory. Here's something that again uses the axis type of call. So the axis call again can have two states or multiple states. In fact, you can have a whole range of numbers depending on what's pressed, and it also accepts things like controller input, like as a stick, as like a continuous range from one number to another. So if you wanted, say, fine control of your movement, you could accelerate or decelerate that depending on how far the stick is pushed, and that could be passed in as a float. So in this case, the way I've used it is to call one of two. Well, it's essentially calling the same function but with a setting changed, and I'll show you that here. So basically, this is being used to call the. Where is it? Here we go. So this is being used to determine what the material is. So normally the material would be whatever the material setting is that we have. I've not set that up just yet, but I've also made it so that it's possible to set the material to 0 if additive is not true. So basically, if we're adding blocks or taking away blocks, and if the material is 0, then it's considered air in the engine, so it's just like removing them from the scene. And then that's used later on down here when we're passing into our brushes that we've covered previously. And we're just telling it what material to use, whether or not it is something or it isn't. Another important thing that we've got here is the selection point. So this is essentially the point in front of the camera at which the brush needs to be placed, the position in the scene where the brush is being placed. And all this is taking the camera's position, taking the vector in front of that, depending on there's basically a variable somewhere that says that it's called the placement distance, and that's how far away from the camera we want the brush to be placed, and that's currently mapped to the scroll wheel. So if, say, you want the brush to be placed further away from the camera, you scroll forward, and back is the inverse. So we're just essentially saying this is the point in front of the camera where these brushes are going to be placed down. So what we're doing here is we just have a switch for the current brush, which is the setting that is determined by the UI controller actually, and also determined by the keys pressed. It tells us what type of brush we are using. So you can see that there's lots of calls for different ones. There's like the columns, for example, planes, etc. And there's also nested switches for those functions that have different, how best to word it, have different orientations. So like a column can be on 3 different axes, right? So we have a dominant axis setting, which essentially allows you to press a button within our controller and swap what axis you're using, while still keeping your X, Y, and Z size settings the same. So if you wanted to rapidly develop using lots of different brushes, but you wanted to keep the sizes of those brushes the same throughout, you just change what the dominant axis is. So that's a super useful distinction to make, and it's something that we thought was quite important to put in the editor. Also possible to spin the voxel, so essentially just change the orientation of the block it is that you want to place into the scene. So another important note to make as well is smoothing currently doesn't actually have to be turned on. So if you don't want this nice smoothing effect where these blocks are automatically shaped to make this brush look more natural, you can turn it off, and that can be shown by the little thing that says VS on the UI, and I believe that's 0, is it, to toggle that on or off? I can't actually remember. It's one of the keys. Oh, 9, there we go. So let's say we're adding in cube's a good example. So let's increase the brush size for cube. So let's put in a cube in the scene. It's automatically smoothed on the corners, right? But if we press 9 and then do the same thing, it's not automatically smoothed out. That's a super useful feature to have, and it's something that is quite important. And I'll go back to the code again to show what I was talking about before. So with the smoothing off, and even with the smoothing on in fact, you can choose the shape that you're placing down, so you don't have to just choose a generic cube if you don't want to initially. You can actually place, say, a plane of ramps or whatever the case may be, and choose what orientation those spawn in on. And this function here is currently not fully developed, but it essentially just... Oh no, sorry, this one is the one that's complete. So this one is just choosing what brush it is that you're using. So you saw me there selecting different brush types in the UI. So with that introduction out of the way, I want to introduce the topic that is the main focus of this episode, which is optimizing the editor that we already have currently, and seeing if we can start making progress on removing some of that lag. And I'll show you one of the optimizations I've already done to make the experience a bit smoother. But the optimization that I've already done isn't going to be enough to fix the extreme lag issues that we've been having. It's just fixing the brush spawning lag that was happening whenever placing something in the scene. So I think it's important to make that distinction between the real-time lag that we're having and the input lag that we were having previously when players were changing the world, essentially. Right. So let's open up the right script. Right, so these are the functions that have received the largest change, and I'll explain what those were quickly. So change voxel, rather than now updating or spawning in rather a model immediately, it does this thing called deferred loading. So it pushes onto a queue a set of coordinates, and then all of the settings for those coordinates are preemptively updated. And then this section here essentially takes care of all of the object spawning that's in the list already, and that happens on a tick basis. So every frame, for example, it loads in 50 blocks that have been edited since the last frame. So let's say we was to spawn in a massive sphere. As you've seen previously, it kind of almost like loads it in almost like a dial-up picture where it goes line by line, and it's not instantaneously in a frame now, because what would happen before is we'd try and spawn in that big block and it would hang as it was loading all of the stuff in the background. Now, it wasn't horrendous, but this method means that the entire experience is smoothed out, and while it may cause some problems at a later date, I feel like they're fixable. So yeah, once it's been pushed onto this stack, it just basically looks at the first item in that list, spawns it in, then removes it from the list. That's as simple as the change gets, really. It's just pushing the loading onto a later point so that it's not all happening at once. And the benefit of this is if you want to spawn in multiple blocks simultaneously, the loading process is a bit slower. Or sorry, it's a lot smoother, I should say. I mean, it is slower as well, but that's a separate thing. And this number can be adjusted quite freely as well, so if we wanted to speed up the loading process like that, it's literally as simple as changing that number. So if we wanted to make it less noticeable when it comes to later on, see that happened, that loaded them twice as fast. And again, we can carry on fine-tuning that number as more optimizations get placed in, and we get closer to a polished editor. Right, so this brings me on to now the topic that I wanted to cover today, which is something called, I've forgotten the name now, instanced meshes. So currently, if we go down to spawn voxel model instance, we have these uStatic mesh components. But to explain why this is slow, we're essentially recreating each model every time we want to spawn a new block in, regardless of whether or not a model of that type is already in the scene. So we're sending all of these unique models to the graphics card every frame, when what we want to be doing is only sending each unique model over to the graphics card every frame, and then just spawning that in lots of times depending on where it is in the scene. So basically my job today is to slow things down a bit now and just show you what I do research-wise in terms of how I tackle a problem like this. No doubt it won't work straight away. I'll probably encounter many issues along the way, but that's part of the development process, and I kind of want to show that off as well. So bear with me 1 second while I start getting up the various things that I'll use. So as with most things, it starts off with a simple Google search, really. not voxels, mesh sensing. This looks like the class that we'll be using. The real challenge in this is working out exactly how these are used and how we take it from what we have here to what we need. So if you guys just bear with me while I take a quick look, and I will have a look at essentially what it is that this class does, and also see if I can find out any more information about how to use it. So this looks like, just having a quick glance, this looks like the place that the instances that I would have been loading this way will be stored. So I presume it's almost like a list of, well, not really a list, but a way to keep track of all of the objects that I've placed in the scene. Right, so this here, to me, would jump out as the thing that I need to use. An interesting challenge, though, that I think might come up is knowing what object exactly is the one that we need to remove. Because obviously we've got to keep track of all the objects that are in the scene and where they are in this object. So yeah, we'll need to keep track of the indexes. But that's fine, we can just add another variable into here that just says what instance it is in the list, and then we'll be able to remove it that way. If this episode is a little slow and quiet, I do apologise. But the whole point in this series, and one thing that I'm really going to double down on, I think now, is this is about me showing you what development's actually like. It's not always going to be glamorous. Sometimes it will be boring. But maybe if you're interested in the kind of work that we do, like regardless of whether you're in it for the end product that we're making or as just someone who's an interested developer, I think showing off the process as it is rather than glamorizing it, making it super exciting is very important, because I don't want to give people essentially the wrong idea. Programming is a very tedious and slow process, and it is something that you have to very much enjoy. Just almost like for the end result. You know, it's like you don't necessarily enjoy programming as an activity. It's not like eating nice food or something like that, but what you get out of it is super rewarding, at least for me. And it's quite important that I show that. I think, anyway. People will have to tell me what they think to this video series over time if it gains any traction, so we'll see how that goes. Right, so the first thing I want to learn how to do is how to actually generate the equivalent of this, but as an instance. The Unreal Engine forums actually can be helpful, but sometimes it's very difficult to find what you need. Right, so this isn't actually directly answering the question, not at least the one that I'm asking, because my question's relating to C++. So it looks like they're just using it as a property, so I'll probably make a bunch of these, one for like each shape. And I believe this is in the constructor. So this seems like fairly standard stuff so far. We're just creating an object and then setting its location in the scene. And then also adding a new instance of that shape in. So it doesn't fully answer the question. One thing I'm going to take a look at again is how to set the model that we're using. I don't know if there's like a set static mesh. Let's have a look. What I'm going to do actually is just start experimenting in the code, do some of the groundwork that I know I need to do, and hopefully something kind of jumps out at me from there. So I think the most sensible place to put it is probably just under my voxel data structures, as that's where they're going to be used. So what the end result is essentially going to be is to replace this with some kind of index, basically. So this will probably end up just being turned into an int, and that'll just be the index in this big list that we'll have as to what object it is we're communicating with whenever we need to make a change. So let's have a look again at the constructor. So I believe there's a constructor in here, or like an example of how to do it. I'm going to put this off to one side while I code it out. Have I spelled that correctly? I think so. I wonder if this thing is outdated. I'll check when it was posted. Oh, it's in 2014, so likely the implementation for this has changed. If I can find something more up to date. No, so it's not showing up. If it's a static mesh component, then something from that. No. So I'm just looking stuff up on the side basically as I go.
Alright, hello, this is...
Cool. On someone else's video audio on the stream. A lot of my time actually is spent now just kind of following other people's tutorials. Unreal Engine's a very difficult thing to learn how to use compared to like Unity, for example. Like Unity I picked up almost straight away. But and I've got C++ experience as well, but having come over to this engine and trying to use it is a very painful process so far. So the way I would have thought it would have worked is almost identically to this, but as a different class instance, but apparently not, for some reason. Because if I look at the documentation here, it apparently has a constructor. I wonder if I'm missing a header or something. Try this one. Is it like it now? Not what I wanted. Let's see. I guess we'll just copy the whole thing in. Also, I am trying to do these live streams in the evening, by the way, but I might try and do them in the day when I'm a little more, you know, awake. But it really depends on how these ones go, really. So gonna like it now? Okay, so it does something at least, right. There should be a way based on the documentation to initialize this. So again, I'm going to bring up the documentation. I keep on opening the editor by accident, but if I open up this on one side, get the code up on the other, So one thing I might try is simply copying this and seeing what it makes of it. Yeah, I didn't think that would work, but hey, it's worth a try. What I'm thinking of doing is basically doing this same thing but in the constructor, so initializing it as I would dynamically normally. So rather than spawning it in here as such, rather than spawning the constructor for the container, doing it in the obviously in the constructor of this function, or in the begin play would probably make the most sense. Then also registering that as well. So I'm essentially just copying the implementation of this but changing how and where it happens. Don't know if this will work, but we'll try it. And in this case we actually want to set it to 0, 0, 0. Because this is just our container, it's not actually the thing that we're spawning in as such. There was that tutorial that I had open before, which I actually think did work, I just wasn't following it quite correctly. So see if I can find that again. Here we go. So they actually do it in the constructor using object initializer. I've done it dynamically at runtime. Don't know if that's necessarily the best approach. I don't think it is, but for now it works. It's fine. What we want to do is call this function here. We actually don't need to do all of this registering of components anymore, which in and of itself will massively speed up things. Right, so I'm just thinking about how to proceed from here. Normally I'd be a bit more on it, but I've just just got tired all of a sudden. Probably should have got a coffee actually before doing this, but too close to going to bed now before doing it, but I'll remember it for next time. So this bit is the bit that we'll need to edit next. Super important. We need to remember. Actually, we have a shape ID already, so yeah, we'll just leave that as IDs. So this will be the point in that shape list that it'll be referencing. So we'll need to both create the instance what am I doing? Right, so the 0 block, is that the flat one? Yeah, so this is the flat plane. So we've got the flat shape, and we want to add instance. Then we need the instance transform, so that would be whatever it was that we set it to before, so these settings here. I believe it'll want an F vector, presumably. Try that. Right, so it wants all three of those things. Leave that as default for now. And same with that one. And then presumably within flat shape there's like an ID for what the size is, or the last number. So whatever the ID of this instance that we've just added is. Just have to find whatever the function is, or variable that it is that we need to reference. Presumably it's an int, so that should help narrow things down a little bit. Oh, okay, so it actually returns an int32, so we might be able to use that to our advantage. Just stick that in front of it, I guess. That works, right? Can't see why not. So now we just need to work out how to update the model for that. What I'm going to do actually is leave this in for now, so I'm going to have two implementations running in parallel, and just remember to clean those up at the end. Just so that I can actually run the damn thing, test it. So, one thing I'm just not sure about is how exactly do we update the model for this, for the instance? Take it in the constructor maybe? Sorry, I looked on a bit of a tangent there. So the way this guy does it, let's see. Something called a mesh actor. This is something that only really needs to be done once, so I'll move that where I've constructed the rest of it. I'm going to uncomment all of this for now because I do want it to still work, of course. This is the only bit that I'm going to leave changed. And I'll see what kind of I'll see what kind of results I get from this. So all we've actually done is just added an instanced mesh container, set its location in world space, and added a single material to its list and a single mesh to its list and changed its position. So we have made quite a few changes, so I expect the compile will take some time. There is also a possibility that this just doesn't even work anyway, simply because these might need some kind of default parameters. I don't know if I can just construct them like that. They might need to be set at 111, for example, rather than 000, because that could cause them to disappear potentially. There is also a chance that this just breaks everything, so we'll see how that goes. Quite a funky song actually, I quite like this one. Where's this? Oh, we don't need a fancy name anymore, so I can just do the reason I had to have the name be dynamic for each object was if it had the same name as another object, for example, then there'd be conflicts within the engine. Basically, it wouldn't know what the unique identifier was for that object, which is why there were variables in that name, just so that each space had a unique identifier, basically. Each voxel, rather. See what weird effects this has. Probably won't work. I imagine it'll crash. And it looks like that's what it's done. Yep. Part of the issue is I don't fully understand what I'm doing, really. Is rotation normalized? So I think this is just because I haven't actually put anything inside of the rotation data for that function, so it could actually be quite an easy fix. So we'll see if we can fix that quickly. Look at this in more detail. So let's open up UE4. I'll just do that, maybe. Doubt it'll fix it, but it's always worth a try. And crashed again. Definitely to do with the rotation. So what I'm going to do is probably just convert it from a Euler angle. I believe that's possible. That thing. Nope. Doesn't mind it that way, actually. I'm sure I'm doing this wrong, but oh well. I've just checked chat actually. The reason I didn't see this before is because for whatever reason OBS currently isn't refreshing my chat correctly. But someone suggested that I stream to a different group, so let's try that. Bear with me just one moment. There we go, that's updated now. Hopefully that makes it a bit easier. Can't speak. Hopefully that makes it a bit easier for people to follow now. So thank you, Daddy Robot, for the suggestion. Right, so with that change, my speech is just going completely today. Yeah, with that change, let's have a look at what we can do in terms of getting this to not break. I think what I can do, go one. I'm actually going to turn the overlays off as they're not set up correctly, I don't think, for Mixer. I'll relook at doing that, not tomorrow, but day after. I'm not surprised that crashed at all. But it's definitely a problem with this. Try putting something other than 0 in here, I suppose. Oh, another crash. Okay, let's reevaluate the approach here. I want to know actually if I can put a Euler straight in there rather than a quaternion. I don't think that's a thing, is it? I guess I could just try and do it with just the vector in there. I think it allows that actually. Yeah, it should do, and it doesn't mean I have to initialize anything else either, so let's give that a go. Oh, it actually worked. Would you look at that? Oh, that's cool. I did by no means expect that to work first time round, so that's super awesome. And I know that not everything is in the scene currently, but it is... Well, I guess I don't really know without the sides being in there, but it's not very laggy, so that's a positive sign. Okay, well, I guess I keep on developing with this this setup here. So essentially what we want to do is keep on doing this, but for each panel that we need on each side. And then also set the rotation for those as well. So basically exactly the same as what we've done here, but with the extra stuff. Oh yeah, there isn't a fifth one because the bottom's always flat, which is a useful note that I have tucked away somewhere. Also means actually I can replace this line with the thing that I've just made. need something that will give me like a number to put in, like an ID. And then basically my plan is from there to pass in this as the ID number, so the last shape that was used. And hello OK Bat Games. So are you a streamer on this platform as well, or are you just a games developer? You tried to stream your dev time if you could. So do you mean that you do stream or that you'd like to? Oh, you do stream sometimes, that's good. I'm guessing it's on the Mixer platform then and not like Twitch or something like that. Not much of follows, yeah. Well, I mean, this is my first stream as well, so I mean, steady going. I think you just keep at it, really. That's what I'm trying to do at the moment. Just starting out today, really. So, yeah, good luck to you, man. I'll give you a follow. Right, I think I followed you, so there you go. And have an extra view if I'm free at some point. Hopefully that helps a little bit. Right, so where were we? So basically what I need to do, figure out how to access the individual meshes within this flat shape thing that I've made, this instance mesh container essentially, and then see if I can rotate it. That's not what I need. I need the mesh instance. Nope. I can get the transform, that's not quite what I want. But I think the transform... Does it contain the rotation if I remember correctly? It does, so I will use that, I guess. Right, so I think this is what I can do. So I think I can use the, or rather what I want to be doing is set instance transform, is that, if that's even a thing. Nope. I need the index. there we go. Update instance transform. I think that's what I need. So then what I can do is copy in the index that I've saved. Am I an indie dev as well? Yeah, I am. So basically, myself and my business partner, Joshua Matthews, so I'm Joshua Ellis, we've started a company this year with support of our uni. I'm going to do a quick shameless plug and say go to the website that I've just put in chat. Yeah, if you want to know anything about what we're doing, then just let me know. Any advice for a noob like me? I don't know, it depends on your circumstances. What is it that you're doing at the moment? If you've just started games development and you want to grow it, I don't know, it's a tough one because it's really hard to stand out now in games development. I actually recently wrote a blog post, which you can find on the website that I linked, about revitalizing or revamping, I forget what I called it, your startup after a slump, because we basically had this massive period where we weren't really growing on any platform, like at all. And that was partially because we'd stopped posting as well. But I think there's some bits of information there that might be helpful. Like, one thing I spoke about is having a routine to stick to. So the plan for myself is every day after my part-time work, I will do this live stream no matter what, if I can help it. I tried to start the other day but needed to get all of the Mixer stuff set up because I decided for the first time that Mixer was going to be my new platform. But now that I've actually started it, hopefully I'll be doing that every time I come home from work without fail. And also writing blog posts as well to support, or kind of not just to support the stream, but to support the business. And grow audiences on a few different platforms. Don't just target one thing. But every post that you are doing, like every type of post, should be consistent. Because that's the only way really that you're going to, I'd say, grow in any meaningful way. Because if people don't know who you are, when you're posting, what you're posting, why you're posting, then why are they going to kind of follow along, if that makes sense? YouTube's a good platform if that's something that you want to put effort into. But it really depends on what it is you're going for, really. What's your end goal as an indie dev? Like, what do you want to get out of it? So you want to make a dream RPG onto mobile. If that's the case and you're wanting to tackle a big project, I'd say, I don't know, it's tough. How big is this RPG that you're planning on doing? Like, give me an idea, maybe some like features that you want, or just the basics. Fair enough. I mean, I would say that first of all, you have to have enough experience to be able to develop certain features. A good example of why is I started doing this engine recently, which I've spoken about in the latest blog update that I did on the website, and very quickly it became apparent that the editor was very laggy, and that's actually the issue I'm trying to fix now. But it would have been a problem that I could have solved from the start had I had experience using Unreal Engine and knowing how to deal with lots of objects in a scene at once. So yes, you can learn as you go, like I'm doing, but I've already got C++ and architectural experience, so I can kind of get away with it a little bit. Have you got any kind of like formal education, like university or anything like that? I have a degree in IT, but wasn't that focused when I was in uni. I mean, that's fair enough. Like, for the first year, like, I didn't really know if this field was for me. One of the main things I'd say is if you're trying to do it as a career, like you say, really try to hone in on what it is that you want to do as a part of game dev. Don't go into it thinking, oh, I can do everything all at once. Unless you're kind of doing it like me, where you have to, because it's very difficult learning a lot all at the same time. So let's say you want to get into games developer, but as simply like a UI programmer, for example, just do UI. Because at the moment I'm trying to build a business on top of doing all of the development for the programming side. I work with an artist, but still there's a lot that goes into it. So pick one topic, really stick with it, and like I just say hone your skills on that platform, and also build a portfolio as well. I've been told kind of conflicting information on how that portfolio should be built, but my advice would be use a website builder, because you don't want to waste all that time learning how to do web development as well. It's a waste of time, in my opinion, if that's not what you're interested in. So yeah, build a portfolio online, and then if you get good at one specific thing, just apply to companies that are advertising for that position and grow it from there. If you're wanting to do it personally, then tackle one thing at a time, or work with other people that have similar goals to you. It's super helpful to work with at least one other person. I get that sometimes with projects like yours, it can be useful to have kind of complete creative control, but maybe even just working with an artist, for example, might be helpful. It might allow you to I guess just it gives you the motivation and the drive that you need to move things forward. That's the biggest thing, is having the drive to do it. If you're learning so many topics all at the same time, it can get very overwhelming. So I hope that's helpful in some way. I don't know. But anyway, just to explain the feature that I'm doing right now, so I know that you weren't here before, I'm just converting all of my static meshes, so all of these shapes, over to what are called instanced static meshes. So rather than recreating every object every time I want it to render, I'm just sending one of each of these shapes over to the GPU, and then that's getting rendered multiple times, rather than sending multiple over to the GPU and rendering all of them separately. Which is why these flat ones look so different from these ones, because I've not fully converted it over yet. I'm just working out the quirks of instanced meshes right now. Out of curiosity, I want to see if I can flip this. Because if I can flip the one in the first position, then I know it's worked. No, that didn't work. Okay. Maybe I also need the position in there as well. I'll try adding in the F vector. I'm not sure which way round these will need to be for the constructor, mind you. That seems about right, I'd say. Can I ask as well, by the way, is the music too loud, too quiet? Oh, that did something. Oh, well, that worked. That's cool. Well, that's working though. I've managed to get it flipped around, so now I can start converting over the material system. Just as a test as well, I'm going to convert the bottom material just to see if it's possible. Right, I completely forgot about this, but when I first set this up, I had to use this super horrible function call, setting materials. I still don't fully understand what it does, I just know that it works. So let's see if that does what it's supposed to. Just realised as well it's going to be quite hard to tell because it's the bottom one, so I'll put the material on the top. That being said, I would have thought it would apply to all of them, but apparently not. Oh, I see, right, it's doing it to element 0. Just change that to there. Could do them to all the topside materials now, since we're saving the index. Oh, okay. The one thing that's also become apparent when converting over to these instanced meshes is that I'm also going to have to make the thing that's referenced here a combination of both the shape and the material, because from what I understand of having all of these instance meshes is they'll all have to share the same material, which isn't actually the intended end result. I want the materials to be able to be dynamic per block, but luckily we only have a limited amount of blocks and a limited amount of colours, so it shouldn't be too much of a problem, but it will be something I'll need to add in eventually. What's my favourite colour? Good question. Used to always be orange, actually, but I can never wear orange, like, so I never am able to really use my favourite colour, if that makes sense. What about yours, Daddy Robot? What's your favourite colour? What I need to do is try and get this, try and get mixer overlays, see if I can get those to work. I mean, you can wear orange, but it doesn't really suit me, let's put it that way. Oh, and you like green? Nice. Green's not a bad colour. Light green. Have you guys know each other, or first time meeting? Fair enough. I guess is it a small community on the Mixer platform then? Oh, you wrote a script for it. That's very programmer-like of you. A few bigger ones who do Dev Mondays. Okay, fair enough. What's special about Mondays, or is it just the day that everyone's decided to do? Fair enough. What I'd be interested in doing actually at some point, if this grew to the point where it's big enough, and you guys will have to tell me if this is a good idea or not, is getting my work partner to also stream on Mixer. And to do that, you know, you can do that partnered thing where you share like multiple views on the same stream, where he's like doing the art side and I'm doing the programming. Like, I think that would be quite unique. But obviously we'd have to grow it to the point where it's possible to do that, so I think you have to be partnered. And in response to the question, so what's the pitch on your game? So the pitch of this game is, imagine Minecraft, and in fact I'll bring up the blog post I wrote recently so I can illustrate what I'm on about. Bear with me 1 second. Right, so imagine Minecraft meets similar to how Age of Empires does their terrain, if you've ever played that game. So this image is of the terrain editor before I broke it. And basically what I want to do is make it so that this terrain editor extends to things like foliage and AI, props and that kind of thing, and so turning it into like a top-down RPG. So it would kind of, I guess, be a bit like a mixture between... There's a developer on YouTube that does this. Let's see if I can find it. I think this is what it's called. Yeah, so there's this guy that does this game series called, well, this game development series on this game called Equilinox, and it's basically like an ecosystem where you grow plants, you grow animals, and they all kind of interact with each other, and you have to like cultivate an ecosystem that basically doesn't die, doesn't kill itself, is sustainable, so that animals can eat other animals and that kind of thing. And I want to replicate that, but almost like in a Minecraft format, so, but also with elements of an RPG. So it's just a blend of like some interesting ideas that I've seen in various places. So taking the creativity and customizability of a voxel engine, mixing it with the ecosystem interaction of this game, and looking at it through the lens of an RPG that would control similar to like games like Dota, if you've ever played those. It's a bit of a contrived way of explaining it, but like I think that's the fastest way I can. So, does that make sense? Yeah, kind of. Voxel World Sim RPG. Yeah, that's a lot more. That's a lot more of a concise way of putting it. Well, thanks, man. I hope your stuff goes well too. I know that you guys are also doing development, so I'll be sure to try and follow along with what you guys are doing and see what comes out of it. What's my dev time frame? So we're quite fortunate in that we have until basically the end of this academic year. So come September, we'll be going into our 3rd year of university. So we're hoping to get it somewhat, maybe not complete, but at least ready to release on like a beta or alpha or that kind of thing onto Steam. So that's our time frame, but we're hoping to have a demo up by January, February, where we can show off some of maybe the AI. Maybe that's a little bit optimistic because there's still a lot of work to go into the editor as of yet, but if we could get something even primitive, that would be great, and we can show that off around that time. Oh, you can't put minus signs in variable names, that's annoying. I will have to come up with appropriate names for each block. Oh, in fact, I need to rename this, don't I? Since there's so many instances. Block tippy top, yeah. I basically feel like I'm just making up names at this point. So just to show you guys what I'm actually referring to with these variables, I'm basically just coming up with names for each of the shapes that are used currently in the editor. So this would be I guess that would be different from corner. There's corner up and corner down, so it's going to get very convoluted very quickly. Oops. I think that's all of them for now. So I'll get rid of that one. Let's double check. So now I've got a list of them somewhere. Here we go. So flat, corner down, ramp, corner up, opposing, and another flat one. Okay, yeah, so that's all of them so far. So the bit that I'm trying to do currently is I need to work out how to use this old system but with instanced meshes. So I would have thought that just calling whatever the set material function was would have worked, but apparently not. I don't know why it wants a material index, because I thought the whole point was you couldn't set individual materials. It didn't seem to work before, so... Oh well, let's try it again. There's no harm in trying, I suppose. But just to give you guys a heads up, as it's getting up to 3 o'clock, I'm going to end the stream shortly and go to bed, so I'll try and get this fixed before I disappear. But yeah, I will be signing off shortly. And in terms of how often I'm streaming, I'll have to get some kind of schedule up on the description or whatever. I'm kind of new to Mixer, so I don't really know how it fully works, but I'll probably put a schedule in the description of the page. But yeah, anyway, I'll be streaming on Sundays, Mondays, Tuesdays, and Thursdays. But obviously, if you followed, then you'll get notified of that anyway. And I think my times are going to be for around... I'm going to try and aim for around 12, but it will likely be later. So you just have to keep an eye on the time after that. Oops, not what I wanted to do. I'll reuse this link, so I think it might have some material data in it. Right, so at this point I've hit a bit of a wall. What I'm going to do is leave a comment here saying, I don't know, end point of stream. And then in Thursday's episode, or rather Thursday's live stream, because this will be going up on YouTube at a different time, most likely it'll be going up quite a lot later because we've got a backlog of content that we need to upload first. I'll pick back up at some point, you know, when we do it. I do apologise if I've been a bit rambly and not quite with it this stream, as it's my first time getting back into this. But hopefully moving forward, like, things will get better as they did previously when I was working on stuff. So I just want to thank you guys for joining, and hope you have a nice week.